Thank you very much, David, for that very gracious introduction. It's nice to be here at UNLV. Before I was at what we call Skettle at Arizona State University, my husband Jack Duty here and I were at Villanova University for many years, and so we share something in common. Raleigh Massimino. You had Raleigh here for a few years after we at Villanova were very fortunate to have him for quite a number of years. And if I were telling stories out of school, I would say that my husband Jack not only knew Raleigh well, but he and the faculty would have a little softball game at the end of each year, play against the basketball players. And I think the faculty always won. I don't know if the basketball players ever won the softball game, but it was a good time, and Raleigh would have quite an Italian feast at his house following that. So he moved from the main line to this beautiful desert university. So I wish I were talking about a happier subject today, because I think that we all know that our nation is facing a problem or two currently. Most of you have grown up in a time where it's pretty much always been that way, I think. But it hasn't always been that way. Politics is the great divider in contemporary American society, topping the long list of issues upon which Americans disagree, including racial justice, climate change, attitudes towards police power, foreign policy, the economy, and a plethora of religious and social issues. As you all surely know, the recent presidential election and the one before that have made the partisan battle lines in the country even more pronounced. Disagreement, fragmentation, anger, even hatred all too often characterize politics in the United States today. If America was once thought to be a shining city upon a hill, the current prospects are, unfortunately, not so bright. To paraphrase P.G. Woodhouse, Americans have the look of a people who had drunk the cup of life and found a dead beetle at the bottom. In 2021, the people of America are at war with each other, engaged in a kind of cold, uncivil war that threatens to end in the dissolution of the nation. For all the pains of growing up and bettering ourselves over many years, lately as a nation, we have taken some huge steps backwards, sort of like men do when they go through midlife crisis. The problem, though, to quote Woodhouse again, is that boyhood is like the measles. It's one of those complaints which a man should catch young and have done with, for when it comes in middle life, it's apt to be serious. Why would some would like to hold Trump primarily responsible for the intense animosity among the citizens today, the facts actually don't back up this conclusion. The problem is larger than Trump, deeper than disagreement about the presidency. According to the Pew Foundation, Americans generally believe that the polarization characterizing the United States today is, quote, more than just politics and policy, unquote. Let me repeat that. Pew did a study, and the majority of Americans said that the problems we're facing today are about more than policy and even more than about politics. Shortly before the election, approximately 80% of registered voters in both parties claimed that the difference between them is about, quote, core American values, unquote. 90%, again, both R's and D's, are worried that, if successful, the other side will permanently harm the country. In other words, this is not fundamentally about Trump. It is about us. There's one sense in which it might seem to be a good thing that Americans aren't just squabbling about petty partisan issues, but instead are disagreeing about things that actually matter. After all, this is how a nation recurs to its first principles, how we recall our reason for being, and have the chance, if we choose, to rededicate ourselves to the cause of our country. But in the present moment, rather than engaging fellow citizens with whom we disagree about core values, many Americans have decided to turn their backs on their protagonists, demonstrating their disrespect and, in fact, unwillingness even to listen. This method, which maybe we should call the Middlebury mode, strikes at the heart of civic life in a free society. For if words are no longer the medium of exchange, then the political art of persuasion fails, and all that is left is the exercise of sheer power. What is it that Americans are so divided about today? Which core values are at stake? And how does each side understand what it stands for and what it stands against? One way to sum up the different contemporary American types, and Pew gave this example, that each side said what it thought the other side thought of them. One side thought the other side saw them as, quote, the soy latte drinking godless hippie elite, probably from Vermont. And the other side said, the way we're seen, is, quote, the deplorable, homophobic, xenophobic, gynophobic, racist, gun-toting bigots, definitely from Texas. No, well, maybe Las Vegas, no. No wonder then that each camp feels that the other side simply doesn't understand people like them. That's what people are generally saying, that they feel like in this disagreement, the other side doesn't even understand people like them. Still, it's easier to identify the character types and the policy issues we disagree about than to explain the root cause of the disagreement. Climate change, racial injustice, sex and marriage issues, abortion, immigration, law enforcement, okay, we get that. But why? Why? This is a question that Pew and a host of other institutions of expertise have really not answered. How would you answer this question? How would you answer this question? Are you one of the people who considers yourself to be on one side or the other of the contemporary political camps? Do you distrust people in the other camp? Do you think that if they are at the helm for very long, that they'll harm the country, perhaps irretrievably? If you answered yes to these questions, then can you say why? What's at the bottom of that distrust of the other side? Why is the other side so wrong and so harmful to the things you think are good and right? And what, if anything, can be done about it? Does our constitutional system provide us the tools to deal with this kind of foundational disagreement? And finally, what do you think the future holds for America, given the existence of such a fractured and factionalized citizenry? Can a nation composed of citizens who disagree so deeply long endure? Do citizens of a Republican polity have to share in a common cause? That's what we finally have to ask ourselves. Is it all right to disagree even about core values? Or do we have to share something in common? Do we have to be united by the bonds of civic affection, civic trust, civic respect, and ultimately civic friendship? In a word, does a nation have to be composed of citizens who constitute, in the decisive sense, one people? So that's the question for today. Classical thinkers, and now I'm moving just a little bit into David's territory here, and he'll correct me if I've got this incorrect. But classical thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle believe that every political order is some kind of association with a generally agreed upon end or purpose. All political associations aim towards some conception of justice, though they differ about what that justice consists in. Is it based on merit, on wealth, on equality? In tyrannies, for example, justice is simply power. In aristocracies, at least by name, merit is determinative of just distribution. In oligarchies, wealth is a key factor. And in constitutional democracies, justice is based on individual equality before the law. Given that each polity has a particular conception of justice that defines it, to sustain itself, it has to be concerned about educating the citizens or subjects in a particular spirit that forms its core. In tyrannies and oligarchies, most or part of the population is polarized and alienated. Conversely, in regimes dedicated to justice and the common good, and that might be a phrase you've heard before when you think of justice and the general good, for those of you who studied the Federalist papers that Madison talks about, right, in Federalist 51. For those kinds of polities, the aim is to produce concord and friendship among the people. According to Aristotle, in fact, the special business of the political art is to produce friendship. Isn't that lovely? The special business of the political art is to produce friendship. We don't tend to think that way today about politics, do we? That what politics is really about is bringing people together in something even more than justice, and we call that in friendship. Now, this kind of friendship that characterizes the relationship between citizens is a kind of concord or like-mindedness, an agreement of opinion, as it were, about what is just and advantageous, which in turn forms a basis for public decisions and actions. There are two main kinds of civic friendships. One is grounded in legal considerations, and the other in moral precept. The first is based on contractual agreement, and the second on trust. In respect to the latter, citizens are motivated by more than contracts and laws. They are inspired by goodwill and a concern for the way of life of their polity, its ethos, including the moral views and characters of their fellow citizens. For Aristotle, then, when the citizens of a polis do not have to know each other personally, they do have to possess knowledge of the political views and moral character of their fellow citizens and care about their improvement. Since the only practical mode of political communication in ancient Greece was by speeches in the assembly, the classics believed that a self-governing polity or republic had to be small in size of territory and in population. They thought that its citizens must participate in the assembly and public festivals together, and that they must be commonly educated and must intermarry. Now, despite the nostalgia felt by some contemporary communitarians and rural agrarians, perhaps folks like Wendell Berry, such a way of life is long gone. We live in a very, very different world today. Different politically, geographically, technologically, economically, religiously, and morally. A world that is faster paced and more complicated, less personal, less caring, but not necessarily less invasive. As Montesquieu taught, citizenship in the modern commercial republic is based neither on virtue nor on concord, but rather on utility. The rise of international commercial activity brought about by improved technology, Montesquieu said, has a softening effect on nations and on mores, leading to increased trade and cooperation based on mutual self-interest, thereby reducing the allure of war and conquest. In effect, he said, commerce unites modern nations. It does not, however, unite individuals. Unlike the old and small agricultural polis, the modern large commercial republic is characterized by civic discord rather than civic friendship, with its diversity in classes, occupations, religions, and interests. This has its upside, though, according to Montesquieu, for these political forces and counterforces can be pitted against each other to form a kind of dynamic equilibrium in government and society. You've heard of this. Balancing the powers of government, separating and balancing powers, a kind of taking Newton and applying it to politics, pitting one branch of the legislature against the other, the legislature against the executive, and various classes in the society, the commons and the lords, both in society and in government. So this can have a positive effect, according to Montesquieu. Still, he warned, like springs being stretched, the dynamic, elastic movements that accommodate the rival interests in society can only be pulled so tautly before ultimately snapping. So where does the American constitutional order and way of life fit into these two very different pictures of civic discourse, civic discordance on the one hand and civic concord on the other? Is the situation we find ourselves in today one to be concerned about, or is it part and parcel of the modern pluralistic politics of diversity? You may recall that James Madison, one of the major architects of the American constitutional order, argued that the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. Who's heard that phrase before? Some of you have been studying Federalist 10, right? That the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. Therefore, rather than attempt to remove or eradicate these causes of faction, and what are the causes of faction? Differences in opinions, passions, and interests, according to Madison. Rather than remove those causes of faction, Madison said, we should try to control the effects. And we should make the multiplicity of interests and views present in a large republic work to our advantage. Let the many and varied narrow views and selfish interests cancel each other out. You see how he's building a Montesquieu there, right? Let these partial and prejudicial views and selfish and narrow interests pit them against each other and let them cancel each other out, so that justice and the general good can ultimately sit in judgment on public decisions. In essence, Madison agreed with Montesquieu regarding the separation of powers and checks and balances that should be employed in government. And in this way supported the notion of what might be called a politics of conflict. That is, faction pitted against faction, ambition pitted against ambition. But this is only one part of Madison's vision of how Republican government should work. He also envisioned creating a political environment in which public opinion can be formed, refined, and enlarged. In this way, public opinion can be the ruling authority as well as the key stabilizing and uniting element of the republic. Accordingly, unlike Montesquieu, Madison reclaimed the classical idea that each regime has a predominant view of justice that defines the association and shapes the characters and views of the citizens. This is important in Madison. So on the one hand, you have this kind of politics of conflict, ambition versus ambition, interest versus ambition, that creates a kind of equilibrium, he said, in society. But this is actually for the purpose of providing an environment in which public opinion can be refined and enlarged, and thus uniting society on the basis of the most fundamental views about justice. Nonetheless, Madison parted way with the classics about the size of the territory and population. This departure gave a wholly new look, though not a wholly new purpose, to the polity we call republic. What does Madison's republic look like? And what was it designed to achieve? Rather than the small polity of classical times, Madison envisioned a large territory, an empire even. He uses that term, empire. And despite what heretofore had seemed impossible, he called for the citizens in this large republic to unite in a, quote, common cause. This is Madison's phrase, unite in a common cause, regardless of their diverse religions, geographical locations, cultural differences, and varying interests. Further, he asked Americans to come together in, quote, brotherly affection, unquote, and, quote, benevolence, unquote, for one another. That's Madison, that we should come together to create one paramount empire of reason, benevolence, and brotherly affection. What was Madison thinking? Was his plan tenable? Is it possible to share a common cause grounded in a common conception of justice in a large commercial republic constituted by so many people and so much diversity of interests, religions, and views? And if it's possible, is it desirable? In the 17th and 18th century, various scientific advances and political changes led to the expansion of states and the increase of commerce, including improved means of communication over large swaths of land and sea. This is what Montesquieu first observed, and what others like Gibbon and the Scottish school of philosophers, William Robertson, Hume, and others, sort of jumped on the boat to, that something was changing in the world that was historically, scientifically, technologically, that was changing political opportunities. From this emerged for the first time in human history the possibility of forming a public that was more than a small cadre of citizens meeting face to face in the assembly. The French noted the power of this new phenomena in the years leading up to their revolution. Madison also noted the new and improved means of travel and communication, that it changed the idea of what constitutes a practicable sphere of territory in politics, radically altering the notion that only in a small polity could a people govern themselves. It's Madison, though, who looks at this and says, these improved means of communication means that the old idea that you have to meet together face to face in the assembly in order to communicate, deliberate, that we're no longer confined to that. We can do this over a much larger swath of territory with more people, because we're now using things like the printing press, the Pony Express. People are printing pamphlets and broadsides. There's a public outside of not only Paris now, but in America, it's outside of New York and Philadelphia. This is what causes Paris its problems. Improvements such as, and these are Madison's words, good roads, domestic commerce, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers throughout the entire body of the people, and representatives going from and returning to every part of them, are equivalent to a contraction of the territorial limits and favorable to liberty where these may be too extensive, unquote. So there's an equivalency here. The better you can communicate, the easier it is to communicate. It's like shrinking the territory. You know, we say today, as communication methods improve, that the world is shrinking. It's become a smaller place. You know, Disney's made a lot of money on this idea that the world has become smaller, right? It's a small world after all. That's only possible with these improved means of communication. And so this idea of communication, look at the root of that word. It's the same root as the root of the word commerce. It's this, the commerce from, in goods. There can also be a commerce in ideas. And in fact, that's a phrase that Madison picks up from a Frenchman named Jean-Jacques Barthélemy, the commerce of ideas. In other words, the old notion that a large territory is an invitation to despotism, that all large territories, empires, will become despotic because the people cannot communicate and unite to defend their liberties, had to be rethought in this new age of communication. This is precisely what Madison did, reconfiguring the factor of territorial size in light of the ability of the citizens to communicate their views and via representatives collectively deliberate on public matters. So the famous theory of the extended republic, attributed to Madison, is indeed a unique contribution to political science. But Madison's insight is perhaps less exceptional for its proposed cure for majority faction than it is for the new path it paves for popular government in a new age of communication. Indeed, Madison believed he had discovered a political design that would finally provide a real opportunity for Republican self-government to succeed. And he doesn't mean that just in the modern world, he means in the world, period. That the classics tried to figure out how to do that, but in keeping the polity small, remember Aristotle saw that the problem was, well, what do you do when there's an empire? You're in danger, right, of being overtaken by Persia, right? But if you grow into an empire, you become despotic. So it was a catch-22 for the classics. Madison thinks that for the first time in the history of the world, it might be possible to form a Republican government, by which he means a popular government, that can both be healthy internally and defend itself externally. Well, the large body of citizens spread over an extensive territory the people will certainly not know each other personally. Because of the improved means of communication, they can know about each other's views and characters. And through the processes of public communication and deliberation, they're capable of forming a common cause that undergirds their diverse views and interests. In this sense, then, Madison was not a pluralist. To be sure, he enthusiastically welcomed the presence of a diversity of economic interests, occupations, religions, and so forth. And he was an avid defender of the freedom of speech and freedom of press. But he hoped that the expression of different opinions would, via the deliberative political processes that characterize the American political system, result in the formation of a coalition of majority opinion on the most fundamental political and moral questions. Let me repeat that. For all the diversity in geography and economics and religion, the multiplicity of interests and views that Madison talks about, he also called for a fundamental agreement on the most basic political and moral issues. He called for a common cause despite what he called artificial and circumstantial distinctions. Here's Madison's own words in 1791 in a piece called Consolidation, quote, "Let us eradicate local prejudices and mistaken rivalships to consolidate the affairs of the states into one harmonious interest. And let it be the patriotic study of all to erect over the whole one paramount empire of reason, benevolence, and brotherly affection, unquote. Now, what does this have to do with us today? The size and population of the United States has increased 100-fold since 1787. This has been accompanied by incredible advances in technology, thus allowing an even greater number of citizens and an even larger republic to communicate effectively, and when desired, to unite together to form a popular majority. In fact, the internet and what it spawned, email, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, IMing, and you'll have to teach me what IMing is, I'm not sure, but I've heard of it, have revolutionized communications across the nation and the entire face of the globe. The question today is whether communication is too swift, too facile, making it too easy for a majority, including a majority faction, to form. Remember, for Madison, the space of the extended territory means that time is required to form a majority coalition. You see the space-time axis there. The larger the territory, the more time it takes to form a majority. And during this time, something is supposed to happen: deliberation, debate, consensus forming. It's supposed to take place within the walls of Congress and throughout the entire body of the citizenry. Today, a large territorial space doesn't mean more time and energy are required to form a majority. Advances in communication technology have outstripped the factors they were balanced against in Madisonian theory, resurrecting the danger of majority faction, albeit this time not in the small republic simply, but also in the large republic. Is it simply too easy for people to communicate and unite on the basis of partial interest and prejudice? Is that what this communication revolution has brought about? Add to this the echo chamber phenomena, in which people tend to limit their news sources and chat almost exclusively with those with whom they agree. Is our age of instant and hyper communication spurring the spread of prejudice and thoughtless ideology, destroying the deliberative and measured communicative processes envisioned by Madison? Do you see the question? Is that what we're facing, that for all of the good of the advances in technology, that it's undermining the way and the time that was required to form a measured, thoughtful public opinion about public measures? In a sense, advances in communication technology have recreated the problem of the small republic. We're right back at facing the same danger Athens faced, with the ability for a majority faction to form too easily and then to tread easily on minority rights. It is easier today for the society to divide into a majority and minority faction who, instead of listening to and attempting to accommodate each other, can, if they so desire, engage in the kind of factional, oppressive politics once characteristic of the small republic. But instead of the class warfare between the oligarchs and the Democrats that was characteristic of ancient Greek polities, the contention with our society today consists basically of, on the one hand, a progressive, well-educated, and wealthy class of people located primarily in urban areas, especially on the two American coasts, versus a more conservative, somewhat less educated and less wealthy middle class inhabiting the more rural areas of the Midwest and South. Although the political disagreements are not definitively class-based, they do track along an urban versus rural cultural divide, as well as manifest important educational and occupational distinctions. So we're now full circle back to the question we began with today. Politics in America today is fractured and factionalized, hyper-partisan and polarized, Democrats versus Republicans, progressives versus conservatives, left versus right. Okay, but what is the disagreement between the two camps fundamentally about? And how worried should we be? If we're to take Madison as our guide, I think we have to conclude that the political predicament we find ourselves in today is of a very serious nature. That what is before us is a critical period that will decide the future fate of America. In Federalist 51, Madison declared, "Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and it ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in its pursuit." Like the classical philosophers, Madison believed that every political order has a central principle or idea of justice that informs it, and which is manifest in the citizens' fundamental beliefs and opinions about what is right and wrong. All governments rest on opinion, he believed, and in the absence of this shared public opinion and collective spirit, the political order is living on borrowed time. Certainly, as Madison understood, no government by the people can long endure, whose citizens have nothing in common but a dislike for each other. I take the American people at their word when they say that what is at stake today is about more than policy and partisan issues, that it's about core values and principles. In other words, the battle in America today is about what we fundamentally believe in, what we care about, and what we're really willing to fight for, even perhaps risk our lives for. It's about what we love and what we hate, what we cherish and what we denigrate. It's about our basest fears and our noblest aspirations. In today's United States, comprised of a population of over 300 million, the bonds between citizens are obviously not personal for most Americans, and this makes the presence or absence of a shared principle of justice even more critically important. In delineating the cause of Republican Union in 1792, Madison reminded his fellow Americans that in becoming citizens, each of us makes a pledge, one to every other, based on the natural obligations we possess as human beings. This pledge, he said, is at the core of the American Compact. Madison said at the core of this contract that we make, you see that legal contract is a what we might call a moral contract, a moral debt, a moral obligation that we have one to another. This is in an article he wrote, interestingly enough, entitled Property, because in this article, property, he's playing on the word because he says we have rights of property, but we also have property in our rights and in the free communication of our opinions. So in this essay titled Property, he said this, quote, "Conscience is the most sacred of all property. Nothing can give title to invade a man's conscience or to withhold from it that debt of protection for which the public faith is pledged by the very nature and original conditions of the social pact." What is Madison saying in those words? What is the public pledge to? What is this promise that we make when we enter that social compact? And think of this too, remembering that exchange he has with Jefferson about the earth belongs to the living. Jefferson wants to call a constitutional convention every generation. So Jefferson's figuring out how many years is a generation. He comes up with 19.3 or something, 19 and a few more months. And Madison points out to him, well, you can't just have a constitutional convention every 19.3 or 4 years if you, so that everyone then can explicitly join the social compact, ratify a new constitution, because in fact generations aren't born every 19-point-something years. People are born and die every day. So you would have to have a constitutional convention every moment of every day in order for that to be fair to everyone. So Madison argued that what we need is something that he called tacit consent. This is the same kind of thing you find at the end of Plato's Laws, that those who don't leave the country when they come of age have, in a sense, tacitly consented to the social compact and are citizens in the full sense, and then become voting rights citizens and so forth, so that you actually have entered the American social compact if you're here and you're a citizen, tacitly, even though not explicitly. The social compact is, as it were. And what is that social compact? It's essentially pledging obedience to the laws of the land, right? To this constitution, this thing we call the Constitution. The social compact is, as it were, a pledge, a promise of every individual to every other individual to protect his rights, and particularly the right of conscience and all the rights that flow from it. See, when you enter the social compact, you are entering that it's a pledge to your fellow citizens. It's not a pledge to the government, it's a pledge to your fellow citizens, with whom, because you've given that pledge, make the government legitimate and make it obligatory upon you and your fellow citizens, because it's based on what we call the consent of the governed, right? This promise constitutes the civic debt of every member of civil society to every other member. It's the basis of our public faith and social trust. Madison's lifelong concern with the problem of faction was due to the fact, follow me here, faction is actually a breaking of that pledge that constitutes the original social pact. It's not just a political problem. It's a breaking of that pledge of honoring the rights of others when you trample on the rights of someone else. It's a rule by majority faction is a betrayal of the social pact. Madison's goal was to make majority rule just rule, or as he termed it in a piece he called Vices of the Political System of the United States that he wrote in preparation for the Constitutional Convention, that what the challenge is to place power, the power of the majority, on the side of right, that is, on the side of justice. The basis for this conception of right or justice he found in the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal. In other words, no human being has by nature the right to govern another human being. Thus, consent is required for the establishment and operation of just government. This is another way of saying that by our nature, human beings are capable and have the right to govern themselves. This capacity also means that we are by nature duty-bound to govern ourselves. This is why Madison speaks not only of our right of conscience, a uniquely human right, but the debt each of us owes to protect the freedom and right of conscience of other human beings. The social compact then reflects both the rights of conscience The social compact then reflects both the rights of conscience and self-government and the obligations of conscience and self-government. In essence, we possess the right to be treated as human beings, as ends and beings of dignity, and not means to someone else's ends. And then concomitantly, we also have the obligation to act in accord with what it means to be human, as that being capable of self-government. What we demand, we must give to others. Madison's conception of self-government as the core of American republicanism is the grounds for distinguishing between justice and injustice. faction, and mere power from justice and right. It's a particular conception of justice that's grounded in nature and natural law. Accordingly, natural rights are part of the picture, but so are natural duties, including not only to other human beings, but, at least in Madison's view, to our Creator, which duty he called precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Madison's conception of how we should live our lives is defined by what it means to be human, which in turn is defined by the place of humanity within the natural universe. When Americans say that the polarization of the nation today is because of a disagreement over core values, I believe what is meant is a disagreement over the fundamental question of how we should live our lives. And the question that stands behind this one is, what does it mean to be human? Are we to be guided by nature as understood through the use of our reason and conscience? Are there limits to our nature and obligations imposed on us by being human? Or are human beings much more plastic than traditionally believed, themselves the creators of their own values and visions for unrestricted ways and styles of living? Are we defined by our nature, and so our highest aspirations are fitting to our nature, just as are the limitations that are imposed on us by our nature, that we're not gods? Or is there no such thing as human nature in that sense of something fixed, but rather human beings, humans are kind of plastic, moldable, infinite progress and change and moldability is possible, so that human beings become their own creators of their own values and their own conception of the universe. On one side of the political spectrum are those who understand the American character and way of life is grounded in the permanent human things, often expressed as natural rights and natural law. On the other side of the political spectrum are those who reject the notion of natural law and the permanent human things, who instead view the challenge before us as an historical mission to address past injustices by way of an evolving, diverse morality of equity. From this perspective, social construction takes the place of nature, whether in one's identity, sexuality, spirituality, or values creation. The chasm between these rival perspectives is deeply trenched and will not be easily bridged, if it can be spanned at all. Do you see what a fundamental difference of perspective those two ways of looking at what it means to be human amounts to? Given the foundational character of the disagreement, it is not surprising that each side thinks the other would destroy the common good, or that many feel enmity by their opponent's political views, if not for the holders of the views themselves. The task before America today is certainly a daunting one. As our progenitors understood, and we would do well to recall, no regime can sustain itself on the basis of legal agreement alone. The American Social Compact is at once a legal and moral agreement. And it's the moral compact that makes the legal contract binding and obligatory. In becoming American, each of us made a pledge to every other American, whether explicitly or tacitly, based on the natural obligations we possess as human beings, one to another. This pledge is at the core of the American Union. It is what makes the Union a genuine union, just as it makes the collection of American individuals, quote, one people. This is the promise of civic friendship that constitutes Madison's America. And I want to conclude with a poem from Robert Frost. In a 1955 address to the students at Dartmouth College, Robert Frost recited a poem that most of us are quite familiar with. I'm pretty sure you've heard it. I reproduce it here because it has within it an idea, a thought, that you might not have seen in it before, but which is worth thinking about. That idea is the promise, the American promise. I think that's in this poem of Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds a sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. When Frost finished saying this poem, he remarked, "Now everybody suspected there was something in that line, but I have promises to keep." They kept at me about it, and so I've decided to have a meaning for it, he said. And this is what he said, quote, "Promises may be divided into two kinds. Those I make for myself and those my ancestors made for me, known as the social contract," unquote. This apparently casual construal of this poem by Frost was, of course, the expression of a deeply considered idea. In this poem about the solitary individual who pauses for a time at the edge of a snowy wood on the winter solstice, Frost reminds us of the American promise. He prompts us to remember, like the man pausing in the depths of solitude and separateness, remembered that we are part of a long line of generations of citizens who made a promise to our fellow citizens. And so, the man in Frost's poem made his way along to the fellowship of the village. Like him, we have pledged to live together in community, according to a way of life that is worthy of our ideas and aspirations. In his talk in Hanover on that stormy spring morning of 1955, Robert Frost remembered his own promise, and in so doing, reminded us, his friends and fellow citizens, that we too have promises to keep. Just as we hope America has many miles to go before she sleeps. Thank you. I would be more than happy to take questions, comments, ideas. What do you think this controversy in America is about? Is it about core American values? And what's at the bottom of that? Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for giving your presentation. So my question is, based on the idea from Aristotle that the end goal of the community is friendship, the ethics of Aristotle explains that you should have friends who live virtuous lives. Is it possible that the issue of modern society isn't factioning or the level of communication, that we as a whole have just become less virtuous?
Is the lack of virtue in America today a big part of the problem of the disintegration between and among citizens and perhaps of the society itself? Well, each side thinks that that's exactly what's going on the other side, right? That there's a lack of virtue or values. So it's going to depend on what really are the human virtues, isn't it? The two sides are disagreeing about what those values should be that make us good people. That's what we're disagreeing about. So one side thinks that the other side doesn't have it right, and so yes, it is a problem of not living up to the kind of virtues that Aristotle set forth. But one side is probably a bit more Aristotelian than the other. Those Aristotelian virtues are fairly what we might call traditional. Remember, I mean, besides courage and moderation, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity, ambition, lack of ambition, right? Friendliness, gentleness, wittiness, justice. Actually, I would say both sides probably claim both of those, claim those terms, but where they're really going to disagree is where, and what that justice means, right? So I think the answer to your question is yes, but there's a real big caveat at the end, because it requires us to actually say something about what those virtues are, and especially what the virtue of justice means. And on that, people are going to disagree. So what we've done is really started the conversation rather than ended it. What do you think?
I have no opinion.
Well, if you have opinion later on in the talk, put your hand up again. I'd like to hear it. I'll bet you do have an opinion. Yes, sir.
I had a question, but that's pretty simple. Do you think that now the expansion of social media has changed the American values over time?
Has the extension of the American media changed the values of Americans over time?
Social media, I believe.
Extension of social media changed American values. I don't know that the process of communication has changed our values so much. I think there are other reasons that the values of America has changed. What it's done is highlighted those changes dramatically, right? And the differences dramatically. But I don't think the processes of communication are probably responsible for the way we think. I think they're more responsible for the way we convey what we think, and sometimes do it in less than responsible ways. You know, especially if you can do it with anonymity, then that's going to very much affect not what you think so much as how you say what you think, and the effect that has on others and on the community around you. I think the kind of things that have changed our values, our principles, are not just procedural issues of technology. It's certainly it would seem to have a lot more to do with how we perceive things like the family, how we perceive religion, whether people. I mean, look. When you think about the predominant ideas of your time, if one of the influences on our time are things like Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, that people don't believe in a power higher than themselves anymore, that human beings themselves become the creators of their own values and their own universe, their own horizons. That's to the extent that those things start affecting what we believe, that's obviously going to change our perspective and our fundamental outlook on life, yes? And that's a very different kind of influence, not just on Americans, but on the people of the West, right? Well, look, this is why a lot of the people in Eastern countries think that the West is corrupt, right? Because of these changing values that have to do with what they see as a lack of grounding and fundamental virtues and principles and religion. Yes, ma'am.
So you touched on this idea of trust.
I'm sorry?
On trust.
Trust?
Talk about trust. Could you say a little bit more about what role? You said we have this moral obligation to each other, but do we have a moral obligation to trust each other? And what role does trust play, and how can we build trust?
Oh, it's an excellent question. No, I don't think we have a moral obligation to trust each other. I think trust forms the basis of a healthy political society that understands itself as a union and as one people. And that the basis of that trust is in understanding that we share a common view of, at least generally speaking, very fundamentally speaking. We're going to disagree on all kinds of things, but fundamentally on a view of justice, and that we can, to a great extent, count on each other to act in that way, not be so distrustful that we live in with a band of criminals, right? Look, if one of the things Madison said about the Bill of Rights, as you probably know, he was not in favor originally of adding the amendments to the Constitution that many of the anti-federalists wanted. Yet he's the one who ultimately introduces them, the Bill of Rights, to the first Congress. He does because so many people want these amendments. He doesn't think we need them because our government, unlike England, is one in which the people hold the sovereignty and they give powers to the government rather than the government ceding rights to the people through the Magna Carta and so forth. So we don't want to list rights, he and Hamilton said, because we already retain them, and once you start listing them, there might be the presumption that anything not listed is you don't have, when it should be the opposite. But because so many people, good people, wanted a Bill of Rights and threatened to call a second convention if we didn't promise to add them, he and others promised that they would support a Bill of Rights. And when he does ultimately and introduces them, he's a de facto leader in the first House of Representatives, right after it's formed in 1789. And that spring, one of the first, so one of the first things he does is introduce the Bill of Rights. And one of the things he says is, well, you know, one of the good things about this, after he sort of reconciles himself with doing this, he says is the influence it will have on public opinion. That people will, this Bill of Rights, it'll be sort of, it forms not just a legal purpose, but it has an educational effect on people. It influences the way we think about our rights and our responsibilities to others. And it's sort of a kind of it's a way that a people teaches themselves the rules of self-government. That if I am going to claim freedom of speech, freedom of press, that means all my fellow citizens are claiming that, and that I should respect that in others. And then there's a tendency for the majority to police itself in that regard, or at least not be so worried that people would want to overstep that. One of the interesting things that's going on today is we can't trust others to say, well, I disagree with you, but it's your right to say it. Because we have something very different than that going on today, which is, I disagree with you and you have no right to say that, and I want you silenced. Madison would think that that was a very, very serious problem, because if we're going to disagree, the first thing we have to do is listen as well as speak. That we have responsibilities as well as rights, and that freedom of speech and freedom of the press, he thought, were fundamental to all the other rights that we would exercise. Because look, what is the definition of despotism? What do despots try to do? First and foremost is silence people. They want to stop communication because it's dangerous when people talk to each other and might think differently than the despot. And so a free country, one of the first things it has to protect is that freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And there has to be a trust among fellow citizens that even if we disagree, we at least agree fundamentally that there are basic rights that we share. Right now, America is in a situation where that's no longer the case. And if that is not problematic in a free country, I'm not sure what is. So that's the kind of trust that needs to be at the basis of a political order that's more than just the legal. We have the First Amendment there. That's the legal. But we're not trusting each other that we believe those things anymore. And how do laws change when opinions change? Yes, sir.
So, I got a really important question. I know that we're talking about the divide, right, between opposing sides and polarizing beliefs or different partisans. Now, at this age, my question is that do you think that education for everybody else, because it's the pinnacle of learning things about history and everything else, is important in order for people to be able to think for themselves?
Is education important for people to be able to think for themselves? Yes, as well as to govern themselves. And if I could just quote Madison again, liberty and learning lean on each other. And one without the other is a prologue to a farce or tragedy, or perhaps both. Yeah, education is key, not only to the individual governing himself or herself, what you call virtue in Aristotle, right? There has to be education and habituation in order to achieve that. But that very kind of education of the individual, intellectually and morally, is also necessary for a free country. If you're going to expect the people as a collectivity actually to govern, then they have to be able to govern themselves first and foremost, right? Harriet Beecher Stowe in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was, has anybody read that? Oh, despite its reputation today, it is an absolutely fabulous book. And I encourage you to take a look at it if you have some time and inclination. So there's this slave owner in Kentucky. His name is, interestingly, Augustine St. Clair. I mean, you don't think of St. Augustine there, do you at all? But anyway, he knows that slavery is wrong. And he has a brother. I think he's a twin. So Augustine St. Clair is basically a good man, but he doesn't know what to do. He says, what can one man do? He says, I feel totally trapped because it would take a whole system of education to change this problem. And so what can I do? Because what it will take is so enormous, right? And he has a brother, Alfred, who's sort of like the, the black version of him, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, who has a son named Dodo, who's out there with a slave boy once with his pony, and the kid is beating the slave boy for no apparent reason. You see, he's learned this from his father. And so these are the people that are going to grow up and govern in America. And Harriet Beecher Stowe says this: they who cannot govern themselves cannot govern others. You see, she's playing on that idea of what you call the Aristotelian virtues, the moral virtues. Without those, without teaching those, if you can't govern within your own soul, then you are not capable of being part of a people expected to govern themselves. Because when you say majority rule, you're not just saying that those are the people with power and get to make the decisions. You're saying, at least in America, with this great experiment in self-government, that they're capable of governing themselves, because nobody's higher than the majority. Nobody's got the trump card over the majority. So ultimately, if the majority fails to limit, to restrain, to govern itself on the basis of right, then it won't be done. They will ultimately get their way. And that's why I called it a breaking of the pledge. That majority faction is actually breaking of that first promise, that pledge that you make to one another, that Madison calls that the public faith is pledged, that you respect the conscience and the rights of other human beings, just as you expect them to respect yours. And that has to be done by a people have to actually be capable of governing themselves in order for free government ultimately to work. It's a matter of time if they're not. I mean, you can't expect government if you people you put in office who are contingent on your favor to make that difference. So education is key. So you see the problems that America's facing are complex.
I'd also like to add that just based on observations, is that, that's why I asked about social media, is that a lot of the youth now relies on just hate speech rather than to really have the choice to
I see.
involve themselves in education. The majority of the riots in the disagreements among the lower middle class of American citizens, it's not just about, I'd say, it's not just about not knowing, but the lack of education thereof to be able to govern themselves and make the right, righteous decisions or morally correct decisions. And I think that also adds to the divide of people or biases into.
What is your name?
Miguel Pascal.
McGill, that is really helpful. Thank you for explaining that more. I see what you're saying. You're saying that social media has become a substitute
Yeah.
for traditional ways of educating, whether in the family, the schools, an old kind of public opinion, that it's social media that's now the educator, and that it's a pretty irresponsible doing. You know, I'm not on social media a lot, and so when you put it in those terms, I think I think I understand what you're saying. And in that case, yeah, I think you're exactly right. If it's a substitute, then it does become itself a serious problem, because it's not only falling short, it might even be corrupting a certain educational processing, right?
Absolutely.
Certainly deliberation, there's no deliberation there. And the back and forth is not a particularly healthy debate sometimes, is it?
Yeah, because, for example, today, I asked a question to one of the students, and I asked them, what do you think about the George Floyd letter, something like that situation? And I know he's like 18, he hasn't had experiences in his life yet, but they sort of believe into this
do you think, Miguel, that news station, you know, radio, TV, papers, that those traditional sources reporting the news, that's also declined in terms of reporting stories, or?
As far as it goes with like the printed, or the accredited sources, it has that decline. But the television nowadays is a little bit much more controversial now. The opinion they post on the news is always polarizing, and it also helps to kind of divide us as a whole country. But yeah, some sources of media are definitely a little bit much more misleading, but that wouldn't be all of them. But it takes some research nowadays to be able to read or to even get the quality information that our citizens needed in order for us to be educated on those factors.
Thank you. Yes.
A question, covered, I think, in your lecture, it's very spelled out. I mean, Madison is famous, maybe superficially famous, for saying that the problem, the threat to self-government are factions, right? And factions he defines in a couple of ways. One of them is it's a self-interested party that's not, whose interests are opposed to the common good, the public good. And then he says the genius of the American system is that we multiply factions instead of trying to snuff them out. So, your thesis is then that Julius Madison encourages factions, but we're pursuing interests contrary to the public good. But at the same time, they are expected to have common sense of justice. And so that's the kind of special factions we want.
Yeah, that would be a contradiction if I said that. Let me try to clarify, because that's a really important point for anybody who's interested in the study of Madison, and in the study, and to the extent that Madison really helped design and certainly helped articulate the design and intent and argument and action of the Constitution, it becomes critically important. So there are a number of scholars who argue that what Madison is ultimately arguing for is that you can't remove the causes of faction, that what we'll do is have a multiplicity of factions and let one go against the other. I don't think that's what Madison is arguing. He never uses the term multiplicity of factions, ever. Martin Diamond says he uses that phrase, but it's actually not in Madison. And what is in Madison is a multiplicity of interests and views. He means economic interests, religious views. And he knows that those are going to continue to exist. And to the extent that we can't get rid of those that are prejudicial and so on, he wants them to counteract each other. But he really doesn't want more factions, per se. He actually writes a piece in 1791 clarifying that, and it's called Parties. Because factions and parties, he's using in that piece sort of simultaneously. He says, to want more parties to counteract other parties would be like in ethics to say we should have more vices to counteract the existing ones. And he said that would be as silly to do in politics as it would be to do in ethics. So no, he doesn't want more factions. He wants, to the extent that you can't get rid of the ones that are there, through education, through the deliberative process that's a kind of a public Socratic method of you know, there's sometimes people change their minds through this deliberation between the representatives and the constituents, within Congress itself, because of op-ed pieces in the paper and people going back and forth. You try to get people to see the light when they got something wrong, you know, to change their views, to elevate, refine, and enlarge the public views. To the extent you can do that, you want them to cancel each other out, to create that kind of equilibrium that allows for this debate, discourse, deliberation that can refine and enlarge the public views. So he uses them to the extent that they're there and that the causes, differing opinions, passions, and interests are shown in the nature of man. But he never calls for more factions to counteract other ones. And ultimately, he would be more than happy to get rid of as many as you could through the refinement process. But he's not going to be naive and think that that kind of utopia of somehow us all becoming philosophers is going to happen. So that's why he says, for example, in Federalist 49, you know, we could wish for the philosophic race of kings, you know, that Plato talked about, but it's probably not going to happen. So, you know, a wise government would find it smart to have the prejudices of the community on its side. So he wants that at the same time, I mean, that he wants an educational process that actually elevates our views, that makes us better citizens. And I know that's not the Madison that we're familiar with, and that was the predominant interpretation of Madison for many years, but I think folks were seeing one part of Madison, but not seeing what he really wanted to do that with factions. It was for more than just stopping factions. He was up to something much more interesting, creating a basis in the society to actually refine and enlarge the public views and to create a coalition based on a particular conception of justice. So for me, when I discovered that in him after learning the Madison you set forth, which is the Madison that, you know, was predominant in Robert Dahl and Martin Diamond and others. Martin Diamond lamented it. He thought that's what was there. When I saw that what Madison was really up to was something much grander, much more ambitious. I'll tell you, I'll cite what he says. Here's this shy, you know, 5'4", 5'6" fellow, probably 100 pounds soaking wet, so painfully shy that and when he's speaking in public assemblies, people are always having to ask him to speak up. They can't hear him. One Frenchman called him Mr. Mutterson. And you know, he's always so unlike Hamilton, it's just flamboyant and easy to write a play about, right? Madison, you'd have to work hard to come up with, you know, a Broadway play that could hold people's interest. He doesn't get himself into trouble very often. He's shy. He doesn't marry till he's in his 40s because he's so painfully shy. When he thinks he's figured this out, you can see his excitement just leap off the page. He says, the way this would work is that we want to refine so that this becomes the reason of the public, and that has a further effect, like a cyclical effect on the laws, and then the laws have an effect back on public opinion, so that you're really talking about a people governing themselves ultimately. That this is not a ghostly body politic, you're really talking about a people coming to be capable, proving to the world the capacity of mankind for self-government. And when he thinks he's figured this out, he says, this is the government for which philosophy has been searching and humanity been sighing from the most remote ages. Such are the governments it's the glory of America to have invented and her unrivaled happiness to possess. That's a Republican government that's much more than the Robert Dahl pluralism of just stopping the worst of factions. He's reading Aristotle, he's reading Plato, he's reading Montesquieu. He's seeing what their objectives are, and he's wondering in this new age of which certain things have changed, if it's now possible to answer to some of the questions Aristotle was concerned about, but in that world it wasn't possible to do. Is it possible now because of certain changes that have taken place? And he ultimately thinks, he doesn't think it's gonna be easy, but he sees that there's this new and more noble course for Republican government.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank
Professor
you
Sheehan.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.